Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining this workshop. It's a pleasure to be here to talk to you today about artificial intelligence. Just to introduce myself, my name is Minesh Tanna. I'm a partner and the global AI lead at the law firm Simmons Simmons, and I also chair the Society for Computers and Law AI group. Now, you might be wondering why a lawyer is here talking to you today about artificial intelligence, and I think you're probably all thinking the same thing, which is that lawyers are good for two things. The first is unnecessarily scaring businesses about risk, and the second thing is probably charging too high hourly rates. Well, unfortunately, I am going to do one of those things today, but the good news is I accept all major credit cards. But no, I am going to be talking about data risks today in artificial intelligence, which I think is an increasingly important area for most, if not all, organizations over the next decade. In terms of what we'll cover, I'll start off with a brief introduction to what AI actually is, and I appreciate some of you may be familiar with it, so I won't spend too long on that. I'll briefly look at the role of data in AI, and again, I'm sure you're all familiar with the fundamental points there. I think the bits I really want to focus on today are the two major risks that I see in using data in AI, which is data privacy and bias and discrimination. And I'm sure you're aware of those risks and the consequences they could have for your organization, but I'll hopefully give you a slightly different angle and the way I see things. And I'll also mention a couple of examples of where this has gone wrong for organizations in the past. And finally, we'll talk about risk mitigation, what you can do to alleviate the data risks in artificial intelligence. And really, if you take any word away from this workshop, it's governance. And I'll be talking to you about why, as a lawyer, people like you in this room really matter to me in terms of implementing governance when it comes to AI and data risks. And we'll leave time at the end for some questions, and I'll be here afterwards as well, so happy to take any questions then or discuss any follow-up points. So, we'll start with a brief summary of what AI is. The way I like to think about AI is to distinguish it from traditional software and traditional computing, which, as you probably all know, is principally rule-based. Humans create a set of rules for a piece of computer software to follow. And that could be as simple as Microsoft Excel, for example. Each time you put a formula in, let's say you're trying to reorder text to make it alphabetical, you'll be telling Excel to do that, and there'll be a set of rules behind that function which tell Excel to put words in alphabetical order, to put it simply. But there's a limitation with rule-based systems like that. And the limitation is this: in order to set those rules, humans have to understand a lot about the data they're dealing with. They have to be able to program a very comprehensive set of rules in order to be able to ensure that the program delivers the output that they're seeking. So take the example of autonomous vehicles. It's practically impossible for humans to create a comprehensive, codified set of rules for an autonomous vehicle to follow. Let me use a slightly morbid example of a rabbit in the road. If you wanted to program an autonomous vehicle to stop, do an emergency stop, when it sees a rabbit in the road, think about how you would go about programming a set of rules to do that. It's practically impossible. Just to give you one example, a piece of fluff in the road could look similar to a rabbit, but clearly we don't want autonomous vehicles coming to an emergency stop every time there's a piece of fluff in the road. So there's a limitation on humans' ability to program traditional computing. The answer to this conundrum lies in AI. And really, the essence of AI, and the way that I like to think about it, is that for the first time, we're empowering computers to make rules for themselves. We effectively, and this is typically how machine learning operates, which is a very common form of AI, we give the computer a set of data to review, terabytes of data, perhaps more, and we say to the computer, you review that data yourself, and you find the rules to arrive at the output that we want you to arrive at. So in the case of autonomous vehicles, for example, we will set cars, the computer systems in cars, reviewing all sorts of data, from what's outside a windscreen, what's above the car, what's behind the car, and the computer will itself start to make rules to program itself to drive around the streets. We don't need to tell it what a rabbit looks like. It will learn, because we'll feed it probably millions of images of rabbits and fluff and similar looking items, and hopefully it will work out itself what a rabbit looks like. And so the way I like to think about AI, and really here's the issue, is that it starts to operate autonomously. And if we think of traditional software as automated, set by humans, computers follow the rules set by humans, then AI really is distinct from that, because for the first time, computers are behaving autonomously. And really, particularly as a lawyer, that's where a lot of the risks come in from AI. Now, I appreciate in the real world, it's not quite as granular or distinct as automated and autonomous, and there are shades of grey in between. But what I suggest is that when you're thinking about risk, which I'm sure in many of your roles you do, it's worth thinking about this concept of autonomy, because it does drive you to think about the worst case scenario, which again is something that lawyers do very well. Why now? AI has actually been around since the 1950s, but as I'm sure you're all aware, we're seeing an explosion in AI adoption, and I think we're on the verge of exponential growth in AI. Well, I think the answer lies in two reasons. The first is computer processing power. We now have microprocessors that are able to review huge amounts of data every second. And the second reason is, of course, a concept that's familiar to you all, which is big data. And I don't know if any of you follow the organization Domo, but they have a really interesting way of exemplifying just how much data is used and created every year. So what they do is try and tell you in every minute of the day how much data is being used in areas like this on the slide. And the ones that catch my eye, and this is from 2021, is Twitter. So in every minute of the day in 2021, there were 575,000 tweets. And in every minute of 2021, there were 65,000 photos shared on Instagram. And I think the one that really scared me last year was Amazon over there. $283,000 are spent on Amazon in every minute of the day, or were in 2021. I expect that's gone up by now. So that's almost $1 million every 3.5 minutes. And I remember reading that and having a fairly serious discussion with my wife regarding our Amazon Prime account, because that terrified me a little bit. But the key point really, as well from an artificial intelligence perspective, is that a lot of this is new data. This is data that people are creating, and data is the fuel that drives AI. And it's no surprise that there's going to be a huge increase in AI adoption when there's this much fuel available for companies to exploit and use to their benefit, and also for the good of society. Just going back then, and just to wrap up the short introduction on what AI is, there are generally three types that I consider. Machine learning, which I've mentioned briefly, which is the process of computers learning from data, effectively creating their own rules and acting autonomously. Natural language processing, which is an incredibly powerful area and expanding. And just to give you an example, I act in litigations and arbitrations for tech companies. And I do this on an international level. And I was dealing with an Italian case a few months ago. And previously, for the last however many years of my career, we would use human translators to translate documents like Italian court judgments. For the first time, we trialed an AI-powered NLP translation software. And it slightly saddens me to say, but with all sincerity, it was better than the human translators. It picked up nuances in the Italian court judgments that native speakers of Italian and English, who had been used to translating Italian court judgments for the last 50 years of their lives or so, couldn't pick up. And that's quite a scary prospect. And obviously, not only that, but it was almost instantaneous. It didn't take 8 hours to turn around translation of a court judgment. So that's just how powerful natural language processing is these days. And then the third example, and again, all of these types of AI drive from the same principles I've been mentioning, is facial biometric technology, which again is going to be increasingly powerful but very sensitive going forward. In terms of the role of data in AI, and again, I'm sure you're familiar with this, I've put on the screen a very basic example of a machine learning system. And the way it essentially operates is that there's a very important stage at the start where data is collected and data is prepared. And if you speak to data scientists within your organization or otherwise, what they'll generally say is that the key to developing an accurate and successful AI system lies in this first stage. It's all about the data. And actually, if you were to split up time-wise how long it takes to generate and develop an accurate AI system, probably over 75% of the time is in this first stage. It's in getting the right data and, more importantly, in preparing it so that the computer, the software, is able to review it and able to learn from it properly. But here are our first two flags. You're using data at this immediate stage. You're collecting terabytes upon terabytes of data. That could well be personal data, and it's being used in this very unfamiliar, still unfamiliar environment of autonomous technology. The model's then trained. That's the process whereby effectively the AI system is learning from the data and the humans are making sure it's accurate. It's then tested and then finally deployed. And of course, once it's deployed in the real world, it's then also processing real world data. So again, there's another issue at that stage when the AI system is deployed in the real world when it comes to data. Now, here's the bit where I may lose you because I'm going to talk about a bit of law. Unfortunately, it's back to the GDPR because the first risk when it comes to AI is inevitably in data privacy. Now, what I won't do is go through the usual core rules under the GDPR, which I'm sure you're familiar with. If you're not, you've had a bit of a lucky escape, but I'm not going to go through them now. What I am going to do is pick up on the right-hand side of the screen on perhaps less familiar areas of the GDPR, which create a risk when it comes to AI. And the risk is this. You're probably familiar with Article 22 of the GDPR, which essentially says that you, as data subjects, have the right not to be subject to a decision which is based solely on automated decision-making, and that includes artificial intelligence. Now, there are some exceptions, and I should have said, sorry, the caveat is that an automated decision which produces legal effects on you or similarly significant effects on you. So if you're going for a job, for example, and the employer is using a piece of software which uses AI to screen your CV or maybe to conduct a video interview, that technology exists, you are entitled to say you can't do that unless one of the exceptions applies, and that could be that you provide your consent. Let's say you get over that hurdle as an employer in that scenario. You then face this additional obligation, and this is what I call the hidden risk of AI in the GDPR, and it lies in Articles 13, 14 and 15. And what it says is this: if you are that employer in the scenario I just gave you, you have to be able to provide, in relation to that automated decision making, meaningful information about the logic involved. Now I just want to take a step back. One of the issues with complex AI technology is that it is opaque. And this is the really scary thing about AI. Sometimes as humans, we create technology, we stand back and we marvel at it. And we can do that with AI. But what we can't do sometimes is actually explain how the AI system actually works. And that's a scary prospect. So you may have heard of the term deep learning neural networks. These are very complicated machine learning systems. They're so complicated that we as humans, even the developers of the system, can't actually explain what goes on inside that AI system that allows it to reach its decision. So we say, and you've probably heard the term, that it operates in a black box. So the rules that the AI system creates for itself, which is what I mentioned earlier in terms of what's going on inside that system, are just so complex that we have no idea how they work. And I work with plenty of clients, AI developers, who have systems like that. But there are issues with that. Let's take the employer scenario again. So an employer is using a piece of AI software to conduct video interviews and score candidates on the responses that they give in answer to questions. Now, if the employer can't actually explain why a candidate has been scored in a particular way based on their response, then a whole host of issues can arise. One of them is one we'll cover later, which is bias and discrimination. You effectively can't trace the way that the AI system has reached its decision. The second issue that arises from that is predictability. We can't predict how the AI system is going to behave in the future. And that's also an issue. You're probably all familiar with the Uber vehicle that crashed in Arizona, sadly killing a woman who was crossing the road. Again, there was no way of Uber, the autonomous vehicle AI developers of that vehicle, knowing that it was going to do that. They couldn't predict it because the rules inside that autonomous vehicle AI system were just too complex. They couldn't trace it to see that that would be a consequence of its driving. And so what we say here in Articles 13, 14, and 15 is that there's an obligation on data controllers to be transparent and to be able to explain how the AI system operates. Now, obviously, there are limitations with that, because if you do have a genuine black box, you may not be able to explain everything about how your AI system operates. And I work closely with data regulators. They understand that constraint, and they encourage data controllers, nevertheless, to be as transparent as possible. But I guarantee you, if your organization is using personal data in an AI context or in an automated decision-making context, technology that's perhaps not quite AI, one day you will be subject to an action on the basis of Articles 13, 14, and 15. And you'll remember that in a few years' time. You remember me saying in 2022, there was a lawyer who told us that we may well be subject to a challenge under Articles 13, 14, and 15. And he didn't even charge us for his time. Now, the reason I say that is because we have seen a couple of challenges. And this is this area of the GDPR that just hasn't received much attention. It just hasn't received as much focus as all of the core stuff that I'm sure you've been involved with for a lot of your careers over the past 6 to 10 years. And we had an action in the Dutch courts just a few months ago in 2021. Essentially, drivers for the ride-hailing organizations Uber and Ola Cabs brought an action against the companies, saying, you guys are using AI to make decisions about us, your employees. You're firing us, you're fining us, and it's all done through an AI system. Well, guess what? We've got the right under Articles 13, 14, and 15 to be provided with information about how those AI systems are actually arriving at those decisions to fire us and fine us. And the Dutch courts ruled slightly more favourably in Uber and less favourably in Ola. Now, with Uber, they managed to convince the court, and I think it was probably right, that there were humans involved in the process. And so under Articles 13, 14, and 15, and 22, there wasn't actually solely automated decision-making. There was a human in the loop. But the Dutch court rightly said, you've got to be careful here. You can't just have token human involvement. You can't have an AI system in your organization and just have a human at the end reviewing the decisions or notionally appearing to do something. They've actually got to have meaningful input in the process. That is under appeal still, so we'll see what the Dutch appeal courts have to say. Nevertheless, Uber were ordered to disclose certain information about their algorithms. Ola fared slightly worse. There was solely automated decision-making, and the Dutch court said, you need to disclose information about how those AI systems and algorithms work. And as we'll come on to talk about in the governance section, how many organizations are actually capable of doing this today? I'm not so sure, but it's vitally important. It's vitally important that if you're using AI in your organization, that someone within the organization, hopefully more than one person, is able to explain, at least in high-level terms, how that AI is working. And it's even more important to do that because this technology is only getting more complicated. Just very briefly, there was a similar decision by the Italian Data Protection Authority, which, as some of you may be aware, has been quite active in terms of its enforcement activity. And it was Fudinio, which is another gig economy company. And again, similar sort of issue. There were employees being fined and fired by AI systems. And they said, under Articles 13, 14, and 15, you need to tell us how these AI systems operate. You can't just say they work in a black box and allow them to fire us without explaining exactly how they operate. And in this case, Fudinio got fined millions of euros. So again, it's a very real risk, and it's one, I repeat, if your organization is using personal data in an automated decision-making context, be very alive to this risk. The next risk I want to discuss, and it's a big one, is bias and discrimination. Now, we tend to put those two words together, but you'll appreciate that to a statistician or a data scientist, bias can have quite a technical meaning. So in the two diagrams here, This is effectively what an AI system does in the training process. It reviews the data points that are being given to it, and it tries to detect patterns. Now, in the first example on the left-hand side, we have very few data points. They're established in a linear pattern, and the AI system says, right, I've got the pattern. It's a very straightforward one. You can release me into the real world, and I'll predict some data points for you and make decisions. Now, a statistician would say that is bias. The software tends to go to a particular linear pattern. It's biased towards that pattern because there weren't many data points. But that may not necessarily lead to discrimination. So that's just an example of how bias to a data scientist is different to bias to you and I, for example. On the right-hand screen, on the right-hand side of the slide, is a slightly different pattern, lots of data points. Unfortunately, the AI system isn't able to find a pattern, so there may not be any bias in there, but that could lead to discrimination nonetheless. The key point is there's a slight difference between bias and discrimination. What we're really worried about is when bias leads to discrimination in the form of the decision-making of the AI system. And we mean by discrimination that a set of individuals is treated differently on the basis of protected characteristics, which could be age, gender, sex, religion, ethnicity. And discrimination is quickly becoming an important issue in an AI context. And there's a few reasons for that. There's obviously, rightly so, increasing attention to the issue of discrimination, particularly in the Western world. We're more focused on equality now than we've ever been before, and rightly so. AI is becoming more complicated. It's difficult always to detect discrimination in AI systems. And there have been a number of cases where AI has gone wrong, causing discrimination. I'll just mention one of them, and it was the Facebook job adverts case. Now, Facebook advertises jobs, you may have seen. It has, in the past, had a tendency to advertise certain roles to more women than men. To give you an example, more secretarial jobs are advertised to women on Facebook than men, and slightly ironically, more AI jobs are advertised to men than women on Facebook. Now, I'm sure you'll agree that is an issue that needs to be corrected. Now, the difficulty is, if you were to talk to the AI system and that was possible, the AI system will say, well, hold on, I'm just doing my job here. I've gone and seen that more women click on secretarial job adverts, and that's why I'm showing more of those adverts to women. Now, it was quite difficult for Facebook to detect that issue, but once they did, they obviously saw that there was a problem there. The AI system was perpetuating discrimination in a way that we as humans don't want to see, and so they had to go in and manually correct the algorithm. But that shows that it can happen, that it can be difficult to detect, and it does need human oversight. And discrimination is not just an ethical, responsible, reputational issue. There are obviously legal concerns. There is very strong anti-discrimination law in this country and in many other jurisdictions. Now, broadly speaking, there isn't much AI regulation in the world today. You can use AI without much feta on the way you use it. But there is when it comes to discrimination. We've got very strong legislation preventing discrimination, and that can and will apply to AI. And I expect to see in the next few years lots of instances where AI is challenged on the basis of causing discrimination. I just want to conclude by talking about governance and what do you do about the data risks and indeed all other risks caused by AI. And here is where I think this is going to be of most relevance to you. What I'm finding is that there isn't much AI governance. There isn't much risk mitigation going on out there. What seems to be happening is organizations are leaping onto the AI bandwagon. Their commercial teams, the IT teams, are leaps and bounds ahead of the rest of the organization. They're using AI, but those in charge of dealing with risk for the organization are getting left behind. And it could be because there's a lack of understanding of AI. It's a complex technology, I can understand that. There's also a lack of appreciation of how the organization itself is using AI. How many board members have I spoken to where I say, do you know that your bank is using AI in this way and that it causes risks? They didn't even know their bank was using AI at all, let alone in the ways I was telling them about. There's then a lack of appreciation of the risks themselves. So again, I've spoken to people in organizations who are all positive for the use of AI, but just haven't even considered fundamental risks like data privacy or discrimination. And then I think the big one really is lack of ownership internally. And here's where I guess I would implore all of you in your roles in your organizations to think about where you fit in terms of AI governance. If your organization is using AI today, where do you fit in terms of the risks that AI causes? And if it's not yet using AI, where will you fit in the future? Now, there's a tendency to think that this is the domain of lawyers because there are legal risks. That's true to a certain extent, but when we think about data, there are data ethics issues, there's data governance. Add AI governance to that train of thought. So for you as CIOs, as CISOs, start to think about how you can contribute to AI governance within your organizations, because it's vital that you guys play a role as well. One of the biggest reasons I'd say that is because lawyers are not very good at understanding technology, and I'll say that with all due respect to my peers. So we need people like you who've got experience in digital technology, in digital transformation, to start actually being proactive about AI governance, because sometimes legal teams and C-suite members are not quite up to it yet because AI is so new. But it still causes a lot of risks. So really, if there's one thing that you leave here today from this workshop with, it's to start thinking about how you can improve AI governance within your organizations. And here's just a very short summary of what AI governance, I think, means to me in very high level terms. It starts with knowledge and understanding. Spread awareness in your organizations about AI, about how it's being used. Think about what processes you can implement in order to ensure that AI governance remains effective. Have you got an inventory of AI use cases in your organization? Do you know when someone in your IT team is thinking about procuring an AI system? And then also think about bodies and functions which are established to deal with AI. Maybe it falls to you in your roles to deal with AI governance. Maybe you need an entirely separate function to be thinking about AI risk. And obviously, the more you use AI, the more mature your AI governance should be. And again, think about policies. We've recently helped organizations to produce what are called AI explainability statements. They are statements intended to provide meaningful information about the logic involved. They're supposed to be able to answer any request under Articles 13, 14, and 15 for more information about how the AI operates. And again, ask yourselves, if your organization is using AI with personal data, have you got an explainability statement? I think in 5 years' time, we'll see those statements on websites next to privacy notices. They're going to be as important, if not more important. And I'll leave you with, I guess, a fairly scary thought. AI regulation is coming as well. This is not just a matter of best practice or ethics. The EU recently issued a draft regulation. It is a very comprehensive piece of legislation aimed at regulating AI generally. If you're a high risk under that piece of regulation, I won't go into this in much detail, but if you're dealing with a high risk AI system under that regulation, and there's an instance of non-compliance with some pretty onerous obligations in that regulation, you could be fined up to 6% of your global annual turnover. That's higher than the GDPR, and that regulation will be here in a few years' time. And so I said I was going to create some risks and scaremonger businesses, and I'll leave on that note. But thank you very much, and very happy to take questions.